Rob Vanderlan. I'm a Senior Associate Director at Cornell. I work there in the Center for Teaching Innovation. I've also been faculty at Cornell and other places. And long ago, I was a student here. So my connections here are fairly deep. And I'm going to draw on all of those experiences today, as well as the work of my great colleagues at Cornell in the Center for Teaching Innovation and on the faculty. So, centering the student, learning and teaching in a hopefully post-pandemic world. And hopefully, I haven't cursed us by invoking that. I'm an educated person, a rational person. Of course, I do not believe in curses. I'm also a human being and a sports fan, so I entirely believe in curses. And hopefully, I haven't done anything to us today. On the one hand, we are definitely not post-pandemic. And I don't in any way mean to minimize the ongoing impact of COVID-19. It's going to be with us a long time, and it's going to have a really profound impact on learning for a long time, and we all know that. But we are post-pandemic in the sense that that initial rush to emergency remote teaching, and then to some sort of remote planned online teaching, and then to what we did at Cornell, where we had socially distanced in-person students and online students in a hybrid environment. All of those quickly put together ad hoc experiments in different learning modalities are really behind us. And we've, as many institutions have largely returned to in-person teaching, although with a lot more online and hybrid learning mixed in. But in another sense, I want to lean into the word hopefully. It can be difficult to be filled with hope during these days for lots of reasons. You only have to open a newspaper this morning, actually, to be reminded about some of those challenges. But I find hope is essential to our work, and I'm hoping that word again to convince you that there's a hopeful narrative to come out of pandemic teaching. And I'm going to preview that argument really briefly. It's basically, that's the narrative I'm going to tell has three strands. First, I'm going to highlight the work that had been done in recent decades to improve teaching and learning. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which the pandemic catalyzed these changes, brought them directly into the experience of faculty in ways that nothing before ever really had. And then third, I'm going to talk about why we might see a future with accelerated growth of these changes, not a sudden technology-inspired disruption or pandemic-inspired disruption, but momentum-building progress in lots of small ways that leave me hopeful. To make this argument, to take you on this story, I'm going to alternate between some history. Never invite a historian to do a keynote unless you want to learn some history, or I don't even know if you'll learn, but here's some history, certainly. But I'm going to intersperse that history with some contemporary examples that came from Cornell during the pandemic. So it's going to be a sort of an overview of how we got here, interspersed with some of the changes that we're seeing, the small ways in which students are being centered in learning in exciting ways. So as I said, I'm a historian. So I'm going to start with some history, how we got here. Some of this may be very familiar to you. Some of this may be the story of your professional career over the last couple of decades. But for others, it may be relatively new. And even if you've lived it, I think it can be important to take a fresh look in our present context. COVID can be seen to have changed so much, but it arrived as disruptive as it was from a particular social and cultural and institutional context. And so I want to highlight that. Let's get started. I'm actually going to get started with a story. Let me tell you a story about a student who arrived at Cornell a number of decades ago. First person in his family to go to college, arrived at Cornell wanting to be a doctor, arrived excited, intimidated, overwhelmed, although I'm guessing he probably wouldn't have admitted that at the time. He was a pre-med student, so that meant introductory biology courses, introductory chemistry courses. As you can see here, this is Harold Schraga, who taught at Cornell quite a while back, teaching chemistry. The way education at Cornell was structured in those days, those courses, lecture-based courses, hundreds of students, 2 lectures a week, 2 exams during the semester, and a final exam. All the exams were high-stakes, multiple-choice tests. So excited to be at Cornell. He attended lectures every day. He took the best notes he could. He studied really hard for that first set of tests in biology and chemistry, and he did terrible. Low C's, worst grades he'd ever seen in his life, completely new experience. So, okay, Cornell's going to be hard. Dig in, take better notes, review the notes more frequently, study harder, we'll do better. Second set of exams rolled out, worse. Didn't even pass the biology exam, barely passed the chemistry exam. And of course, that triggered all sorts of emotions. This is just evidence they made a mistake in ever admitting me to the school. I don't belong at a place like this. Eventually, managed to put the semester together, scrape by with barely passing grades, transferred out of pre-med, and eventually did okay. Here's the interesting thing, and why I'm setting this story up at some length. The system that student felt, that was working exactly the way it was designed. It was designed to be hard, rigorous, and to weed out those who weren't able or equipped to succeed. That was the experience when I was a student at Cornell. This is Carl Sagan, a famous astronomer, lecturing in one of the lecture halls there. Learning was lecture-based. It was instructor-based. The values were erudition, rigor, hard work, competition. We now know that those are not actually the circumstances that lead to the best learning. They're not an ideal learning environment. And in fact, they're especially poor for underrepresented minorities, for first-generation students, such as the student in our example. And in fact, the very time when that student was struggling through those introductory courses was the time period where that knowledge about how learning happens was beginning to grow and really beginning to inform what we knew about education in higher education settings. Okay, first interlude. I'm going to talk a little bit about a faculty member who came to us in the early fall of 2000. This was pandemic at Cornell semester 2. And this was a faculty member who had taught successfully at Cornell for about 30 years. He taught large introductory classes in sociology. He was well respected and admired by his students. And he came to us in October of 2020 and said, I don't know what to do. My Zoom lectures are so boring. He was teaching the way so many of our faculty immediately jumped to, synchronous sessions on Zoom, trying to duplicate what they had always done. And it just was not working, and he knew this. So we had the same conversations that I'm sure many of you have had with colleagues. We talked about how you might be able to leverage the chat to ask students some questions, get them involved. He began to use breakout rooms to punctuate it, where students could begin to discuss with other students what they had just been exposed to. Eventually, he introduced polling and peer instruction, where he would ask a poll question and then put them in breakout rooms. And all of this persisted when he came back to in-person teaching. And what he, I think, discovered is that the teaching became less about him, less about his performance as a lecturer, and more about being in tune with how his students were learning and what they needed to engage with the course material. So back to our story. Research about teaching and learning was growing in the last few decades. What researchers were learning was that traditional way, that lecture-based high-stakes exam way, was not necessarily the way that's most conducive to learning. Lectures are fine for some things. Actually, they're really great for some things. They're great for inspiration, and they're great for planting ideas, for provoking a thought, to get people started in investing in something, get curious, interested in learning. But they're not necessarily a good way to learn organic chemistry or biochemical engineering or subjects like that. And of course, they're not how we learn in the rest of our lives when we're learning all the time. So this research grew and it coalesced. And I'd like to point to the PCAST report, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology report from 2012 during President Barack Obama's administration. This was a report focused on STEM education, but it looked at what the research was saying about how learning happens and what lessons it could do. It could glean from that. And it was a meta-analysis that looked at the empirical research. And to simplify dramatically for the sake of today, it found that learning really needed to be active. It needed to be applied. It needed to be iterative, and it needed to be collaborative. And those values were really underscoring the practices that the PCAST report emphasized. And they actually came up, there was a really famous appendix that had 14 different evidence-based practices that they really highlighted. I'll just draw out a few of what I think of are the most important and impactful. The importance of small group discussion, the importance of peer instruction, the importance of presenting students with analytical challenges, problem-based learning, group problems and group tests, and writing with peer review. All of these were practices that they really could point to an evidentiary base and highlight. Okay. Second interlude, I'm going to talk about a professor at Cornell in our Johnson College of Business. This is Alexei Chitsi, and he, during the pandemic, introduced concept quizzes for the first time. What he did is at the end of every class period, he would take the last 10 minutes and he would give a conceptual quiz, giving students a chance right away to apply what they'd learned to solve some fairly challenging problems. Interestingly, he did this in pairs. He put students in random paired breakout rooms in Zoom so that they could work together. And he gave them a little more time than he expected they would need, because part of the value here is that he wanted students to connect with each other. He wanted to, in his words, help them build inclusive networks by meeting lots of different students in their class. And he found that this was really successful across the board. And so as he returned to in-person classes, of course, the logistics changed, but the values that he was looking for didn't. He wanted to encourage students to attend class, to pay attention, to immediately be able to apply ideas in these quizzes, and to connect with other students. And that's a practice that's persisted. So we talked about the research base. At the same time, there was efforts to take that research and move it into classrooms. And teaching centers are a handy way to think about this. The teaching centers in US higher education go back 50 years, but they really exploded in the last decade of the 20th century, the first decade of the 21st century, in which teaching centers at R1 institutions like Cornell were founded and began to expand. At smaller liberal arts institutions, you often had teaching centers that were led by faculty members, all invested in trying to share evidence-based pedagogies with their colleagues. What do we know about learning? How do we share that with colleagues? How do we change the way learning is happening in classrooms? How do we make learning more active and share effective techniques for doing that? How do we create inclusive classroom environments where all of our students can feel that they belong and can thrive, succeed? And then how do we assess student learning? How do we assess the success of these efforts? How are we making sure that what we're doing is working? All of that grew, as I said, in that period of time. Third interlude. I want to talk a little bit about peer review at Cornell, one of those research-based practices that I highlighted above, something that had been long in use at Cornell, but not as widespread as we would have hoped. And we talked to a lot of faculty, and a lot of it was that it was a very cumbersome practice to scale. It was very difficult to implement, and that scared off a lot of our faculty. So we'd actually been working to find a tool that would help us with peer review before the pandemic, and we'd actually identified FeedbackFruits as the tool that we thought was most likely. The pandemic proved a great catalyst for this work. Faculty were looking for new ways to interest and engage students, to engage them outside of synchronous environments, to help them build connections, and to help them assess learning, provide opportunities to get feedback on their learning. FeedbackFruits was a tool that could facilitate this, but we turned to faculty members to help spread that word across our faculty. And I want to highlight especially the work of one of our faculty colleagues, Amelia Majiques, who teaches in our Romance Studies program, is a language instructor, but also his scholarly background is in peer review. And so she was able to help us. She proved a great partner to us. She created some videos that we could share with faculty that talked about the benefits of peer review, but also how to make it effective, how to implement it effectively, how to help students implement it in ways that were going to be valuable to them. And her success was such that I love this little piece of evidence. We had a faculty member who had used peer review for years, and he's a pretty vocal proponent of good teaching practices. He had never recommended peer review to a colleague because of the work that had been involved. And he now not only does it himself, but he is one of our sort of champions of peer review as a really important learning practice. Another small impact of the pandemic. So I talked about research. I talked about way that research began to come into practice in teaching centers, although teaching centers often only work with small numbers of faculty. The other big change that's going on during these decades is technology, right? The increase in, or the emergence of learning management systems that allow faculty to share content, to create quizzes, to facilitate discussions, to share video recordings, to begin to integrate other collaboration and learning tools. All of this is growing in the first part of the 21st century, as is the world of online education, right? Expertise in how to create important learning experiences online is really growing during these same decades. But that drive for technology, in an interesting twist, got its most visible manifestation in the emergence of MOOCs. And I highlight the year 2012. That was the year that the big MOOC learning platforms, edX and Coursera and Udacity and FutureLearn sort of emerged almost out of nowhere with huge course enrollments and this idea that they were going to disrupt higher education, that just the way that the newspaper industry had been disrupted by technology, or the music industry had been disrupted by technology, higher education was next. A few institutions could create the greatest educational experiences in the world, share them with the world. That would change everything. Of course, we know that did not happen. And Justin Reich has written a really great book that I like a lot called Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Disrupt Education. It's a book I highly recommend for everybody to read. But one of the things that I don't know that he paid enough attention to is in this, for me anyway, is that the interesting sort of paradox that MOOCs promised to disrupt higher education, but they did it with the most old-fashioned of pedagogies imaginable. They were going to record the best lecturers, share them with the world, and that was going to lead to learning. But as we know, that's not necessarily how learning best happens. Another interlude, connecting students. This comes from Steve Strogatz, who is a faculty member in our math department. You actually may have encountered him. He wrote a popular column in the New York Times for years. He's actually really good at making math fascinating for people like me who don't understand math. Turns out he's also good at making math intelligible for those who need to understand math. He's a really great teacher. But when we moved to pandemic teaching, he was really worried about his students. And, you know, in an in-person lecture hall, he could read their faces, he could connect with them, he could talk to them a bit before or after. And now he was faced with, how do I connect with students in this online space? And how do I check in with them? And he came up with what is a very simple, but I think powerful idea, which is he, on the first day of class, in Zoom, he said, click on the link in chat and tell us how you're feeling today. And he shared a Google Doc and he gave them categories. Are you feeling excited, nervous, weirded out, hungry, sleepy, confused, feverish with chills? Was the pandemic after all, or yay math? And he expected that students would just click an X in a box, and many did, but they often used the opportunity to text comments in. So he had this really great window into what his class was feeling. And he was also sending the message that they were the center of that learning experience. And he knew that the world outside of that classroom, how they came into that class, was actually going to have an impact on that learning. And he wanted them to know that. This, again, is a practice that he has taken to including using polling in in-person classes post-pandemic. So we've talked about that before the pandemic, we had momentum building, learning research was growing, learning practice was being disseminated through teaching centers, learning technologies were facilitating new forms of learning. All of that's great, but the challenges, and I really want to emphasize this, were immense. Most faculty, and I myself, I'm entirely in this as well, they learn by mimicry. You have no formal preparation to teach in higher education. You learn by looking at what your faculty have done, your advisor, other faculty in the department, and then you try to duplicate that. And you begin with lectures. How can I write the lectures that I deliver? Can I borrow them from somebody? How does somebody do this? It's all about that sort of traditional model. They reproduce the model. And then at a research institution like Cornell, it's especially so. Faculty, we all know, they're hired for their research, they're promoted for their research, they're rewarded for their research. And so the energy they focus on teaching can be secondary. So getting them to change the way they're teaching in important ways, to think about it in new ways, is super challenging. And this despite a culture that valorizes innovation. I mean, if you watch television with commercials, which I know most people try to avoid, but try it sometime. Whatever you watch, you're going to see the word innovation in every other commercial, no matter what they're trying to sell. Business books are all about innovation. We renamed our Center for Teaching Excellence into a Center for Teaching Innovation. Everybody is trying to innovate and change, but the obstacles are really important, or are really striking. And then comes the pandemic. And the pandemic did disrupt all of higher education, at least temporarily. It's really sort of amazing. It turned all faculty into innovators, whether they wanted to be or not. It pushed them to think about teaching in new ways, new modalities. Obviously, they had to learn technology frequently, but they also were learning an awful lot more about the higher education learning experience of their students. And that, I think, is really interesting and really significant. So what lessons did our faculty learn? They learned that students need engagement. Think back to that first example who lecturing on Zoom and realizing he was losing all of his students. They need to be engaged. They need to have opportunities to interact with the material. Students need connection. They need to feel a sense of connection to the course content. They need to feel a sense of connection to the instructor, the faculty member, and they need to feel a sense of connection to other students, and they need to have opportunities to connect in all three of those ways. And students need interaction. They need opportunities to use their learning, to apply their learning in various ways. All of these are things that are at the heart of what our teaching center has talked about for years. It's at the heart of the research that I mentioned. But now these were lessons that were being learned by our faculty from their direct personal experience. And that, as you know, drawing on your own experience is really powerful. That made all the difference in the world. Okay, another interlude. Social annotation. This was one of the practices that we really, I think, leaned into over the course of the pandemic, and our faculty did. Social annotation, the idea that, you can annotate a printed article or write in the margins of a book, but now you're doing it digitally and you're doing it socially. You're doing it with a group of people. They can see your annotations and comments. They can respond to them. They can ask you questions. You can see theirs. You're engaging in inquiry-based learning inside of course readings, course documents. Social annotation has a lot of benefits. It can help with your specific disciplinary knowledge, but it also supports inquiry skills, argumentation, critical thinking, metacognition, and it's also a way to build connections with students. We used it in small classes and in quite large. Our David Pizarro is a faculty in psychology. He teaches the large introductory psychology class, which has over 1,000 students. And he used Perusall, a tool to break students into groups of 20. So they were working in their documents and learning from each other in small groups, even in this, this class size that was so immense. And one of the values that I really want to point out in this is that not only are students, engaged in the practice of learning from each other, adding to, complicating, extending the views of their colleagues, but they're also, especially for introductory students, first-year students, first-generation students, they're get concrete evidence about how their colleagues are reading and how their colleagues are processing information and the sorts of questions they're answering. So there's also this sort of socialization into what learning looks like and what the work looks like at a place like Cornell. We ended up using two different social annotation tools, Perusall and Hypothesis, because we felt they had different strengths and applied better to different disciplines. Both ended up getting widespread use. I'll return to the lessons of the pandemic now. In addition to the faculty learning from their experiences, we also worked really hard to collect our student experiences and to share them with faculty. The university did surveys of students a number of times during the pandemic to assess what was working and what wasn't in the various ways we were teaching. And they also did a lot of focus groups. And I just want to share 3 quotes that came out of these focus groups, but that were broadly represented in the survey data as well. The first is, if the lecture isn't interactive, quote, there's little perceived or often realized benefit to showing up in person. As we've returned to in-person teaching, students were really keyed into, well, why am I actually showing up in an in-person learning environment, especially if I'm just going to be a passive listener during that. They wanted opportunities to actually interact and engage and to take advantage of that in-person learning. And our faculty were seeing that in real time. The second one was that overall, any class that emphasizes group work over strict lecture work makes us feel a little more connected. And this seems really straightforward, but I think it's really quite profound. If there's one thing we knew before the pandemic about students, is that they hated group work. They hated group work and they hated it. They really, like, that was just a universal view, and it was changing, but it was changing very slowly. But it's really changed quite profoundly, I think, during the pandemic, is they were looking for opportunities to engage and often finding some of their most meaningful learning experiences during the pandemic to be projects that they were working collectively on. And I think that that's also a change that has persisted. And the third one is related to that. Since it's more difficult to organically form groups or meet in a virtual environment, it's helps to have a professor actively facilitate conversations, group work, teamwork. And this is where I think the tools that we were able to use, like Hypothesis and Perusall for social annotation or FeedbackFruits for peer review, became really essential, because it helped the faculty members prepare students to succeed in these environments. And we know with group work that sort of preparation is really essential to making the learning effective. We also had faculty during the pandemic lean into new technologies in ways they have never have before. Some of this was, explosive use of technologies we'd long supported, like Canvas or Panopto or Ed Discussion, which was a platform that we were using, discussion platforms and stuff. Some of those were tools that we helped them identify because we saw a real benefit and value. FeedbackFruits is a great example as this Hypothesis there. But there were a whole bunch of learning technologies that they would come to us with. Flipgrid, Slack, VoiceThread, Miro, Figma, Mentimeter, Padlet, Jamboards, Goosechase. The list just goes on and on and on. What I think is really striking here is that almost all of these are ways to help facilitate collaborative learning, to make learning more social, more interactive, more collaborative. And that was, again, evidence that our faculty were really grasping the importance of these as sort of foundational principles of learning. Another interlude, I want to share the experience of Jennifer Birkland, who is a faculty member at Cornell in landscape architecture. As a landscape architect, she often would take her students on field trips. They would drive to a site and then they're in a van for the day, and they would experience it together and talk about what they were seeing and learning. Obviously, the pandemic rendered that impossible. So what she eventually did was ask students to create a VR experience to share with their colleagues. Using just Google Cardboard and smartphones, students could go wherever they were. Some of them were on our campus in Ithaca, but a lot of them were distributed to homes nationally and internationally. They could choose a landscape, and they could then create a 3D, an interactive experience that they could share with their fellow students. I really love this because it was an opportunity for students to be creating the knowledge that they were sharing. It was also a way to build those connections. People could see a piece of your life that you had chosen to share, which I think can be really powerful and profound. She found that it actually really, at the end of the day, she felt like there was a richer learning that came out of that than to the physical field trips she had done in the past, which is pretty exciting. And that's an indication or an introduction to some of the more ambitious examples that we had faculty. I focused on some of the smaller changes that people have made, but we saw a lot of faculty get into designing digital storytelling projects, opportunities for students to connect their lives, their experiences, their lived experiences with the course content, the discipline that they were studying, and to present that in creative ways through blog posts, through podcasts, through video stories that they were able to create and share. We saw a lot of great work with do-it-yourself labs. Labs are obviously one of the toughest things to move online. How do you take a chemistry lab and duplicate it online? But it also proved to be an opportunity because a lot of lab courses, especially introductory lab courses, tend to be like cookbook labs. Follow the recipe, see if you get the result at the end that you're supposed to get. There's not necessarily a lot of higher order learning that's going on in those lab experiences. And so do-it-yourself labs proved an opportunity for our faculty to ask students to think a little bit more like scientists. How would you design an experiment? What are the results of that experiment? How would you change it the next time? And students became really creative about setting up their own labs to test their own concepts. And then, as the example from Professor Birkland suggests, some of our faculty got into thinking about virtual and augmented reality and the ways that can facilitate learning. And there are multiple ways. You can, as the professor, you can place yourself in a virtual environment to, for example, a human cell, to better illustrate or explain an important concept. You can also invite students into that experience so that they can explore in a more open-ended way in that immersive environment. Or as Professor Birkland did, you can actually have students create those experiences themselves. And so they're actually have a more ambitious role in sort of designing the learning experience and then sharing it with colleagues. So I want to talk about how we worked with faculty. With all of this change and energy going, in what ways did we try to engage faculty? We did it primarily, when possible, through consultations. Even though the initial call was to work with our faculty at scale, right away we introduced ways for our faculty to connect with us individually and directly. We offered online Zoom sessions, which we continue to offer. We worked with over 1,000 students or 1,000 faculty in those online sessions. And those sessions ranged from, why can't I get my screen to share the proper screen in Zoom, technical questions, to, we're at week 6 of the semester and I find my students' interest is really flagging. What can I do to change the dynamic? How can I better engage them? We did a lot of workshops. A lot of workshops beginning right at the very beginning. And they started very technical, like, okay, you've got to start teaching online in 3 weeks. Here's what you need to know about Zoom, or here's what you need to know about creating instructional video. But they very quickly moved from that immediate technical need over the summer of 2020 towards big teaching questions. How do I build connections in an online environment? How do I create active learning experiences for my students? How do I create myriad ways to provide feedback to students on their learning or to assess their learning? And we worked with over 2,100 faculty in those workshops and webinars in the first 18 months of the pandemic, which is a massive, I don't have the percentage, but it's a massive increase over the numbers that we were typically engaging with. We also offered learning communities, what we call the learning community. We called it What Works, and we invited faculty that we felt had been particularly good at solving a vexing problem. How do I engage students in a socially distanced classroom? Or how do I assess learning in my discipline? And we invited them to share their experiences in a community event, and then to engage in small group discussions with faculty as they shared their ideas and challenges, so we could sort of share what was working and reframe the conversation about not about the size of the task at hand, the obstacles, the vexations, but rather the ways in which people were creatively creating better learning. We also updated our website and created massive amounts of new material, and we saw a huge spike in our web pages. I think we had more than 1 million page views in that first year. Interestingly, though, rather than the numbers, is that what people were searching for changed dramatically. Our 2 #1 pages became collaborative learning and measuring student learning, which was where we talked about assessment strategies. So that really indicated the way in which people's attention focused. What does this mean? It means that we were connecting with far more faculty in far more ways, far more regularly than we ever had before. And I think that that's a typical story. I don't think it's in any way atypical at Cornell. What about persistence? Is this, are we seeing evidence that this is persisting over time? And I think the answer is that we are. Anecdotally, we're seeing a lot more in-class interaction, a lot of faculty who changed the way they did lecturing when they had to do it online, bringing those practices back. We've seen quizzes for low stakes and assessment. We see the growth in online discussions and online exams, group projects, varied assessments. All of that has really continued in quite dramatic ways. Not maybe to the level it was at the pandemic, but double and triple and quadruple what it was once upon a time. I want to just end with one last example, assessing learning. A faculty member who talked about moving from the Blue Book exam, this is a Blue Book exam, to more creative ways to get students to demonstrate their learning, open book tests, which allowed them to be tested and assessed on higher order thinking. And it has said she will never go back to the old way. I'm going to end with 2 quick thoughts. One, I don't want to underestimate the challenges ahead. The worry about we'll just want to go back to business as usual post-pandemic. As I said with the persistence slides, we're not seeing that. The impact of the pandemic on preparation, student preparation. Students are arriving at Cornell less prepared than they have in the past because of the disruptions of the pandemic. We want to think about how we can meet the needs of those students. And burnout. Burnout is an important concern. Our students are under immense stress. The mental health crisis is clear evidence of that. Our faculty who have been supporting students and their teaching and their research are burned out, as are we. So where does that leave us? Well, I think in sum, if we want a hopefully post-pandemic world, we need to acknowledge the way the world has changed, and we need to lean into what we know about what works. Countless small efforts, consultations with individual faculty, engaging faculty as partners, introducing new technologies that better support learning, sharing our successes everywhere we can, advocating with university administrations. All of that takes energy, but it's how change happens. Improvements in education very rarely, perhaps never, come by way of dramatic transformation, Justin Reich writes. They come through deep, long-term commitment to the plodding work. He wrote that before the pandemic, and we have seen some dramatic changes, but I think he's still essentially right. The changes ahead, I think, are going to grow in impact. Tipping points will be reached. Changes accelerate, but ultimately, if we can all continue that plodding work that makes up our day-to-day lives and see lasting, meaningful change as the result of that, that's the hopeful narrative I hope to leave you with.